Great. So we're thinking about the question, is the Bible reliable? And I don't know how you would answer that question. No one can doubt that the Bible is a remarkable book. If you go into the bookshops or look online, you won't find it in any of the bestseller lists of books. That's because whatever year it is, whatever novels are out or biographies, the Bible outstrips them year by year by a long way. Here's a quote from the Times newspaper just a few years back. Forget modern British novelists, TV tie-ins. The Bible is the best-selling book every year. If sales of the Bible were included in bestseller lists, it would be a rare week when anything else would achieve a look-in. It is wonderful, weird that in this godless age, this one book should go on selling every month. And worldwide, well over 100 million copies of the Bible are sold. Now, if you think the Bible is just a book for the Western world, you'd be very wrong. It's the most translated book in the world. It's been translated into more than 3,000 languages. You can get a Bible, a manga Bible. I think there's a new one come out in emoji as well. So all kinds of different languages. I don't know how helpful that would be. But I think still many people really associate the Bible with a storybook for children. A bit of a fairy tale, a bit like, Disney film. Maybe people enjoy reading it, but not a hint of truth in it. So Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, that was centered around the claim that actually the gospel accounts of Jesus' life are far away from a true reflection of his life. And similarly, Richard Dawkins today would say that the gospel accounts we have now are not true accounts. They've been changed through history. So we're going to ask two related questions. The first, you just flick it up. Is the Bible really reliable? Can we trust what it says? And the second one is more about the content. What's the Bible about? What's the storyline of the Bible? What's the message of the Bible? So we're going to think of this first question of reliability. And really it's of huge significance for the Christian faith. Because as we've been hearing, Christianity is all about the person of Jesus. It's about the person of Jesus Christ, his life, his death and his resurrection. And it's historical by nature. It's not the case that Christianity could stand and continue just with the teachings of Jesus, as if the historical events never actually happened. If anyone could actually show that Jesus didn't really live, or that he didn't come back from the dead after 3 days of dying, then the whole Christian faith would completely crumble. As Christians, we believe that God became a man and walked on this earth within history. And so if you want to investigate the claims of Christianity, then you can simply look at the evidence at the time, the accounts that were written down, and assess them to see whether they really measure up. The Bible, it's actually not a book. It's more like a library of books. It's made up of 66 different books. The Old Testament, which is before Jesus came. The New Testament, which has the gospel accounts of his life. And we're not going to think so much about the Old Testament. Actually, there's loads of archaeology, which I'd love to share with you if there were more time, but we'd be here till midnight. But for time's sake, we're going to focus particularly on the New Testament and especially the Gospels, these 4 accounts of Jesus' life. And I'm sure there'll be time afterwards. If there are specific questions on any of it, we can look into that. First basic question, though, is how can we actually know anything at all about history? And in our postmodern times, this question is being asked more and more. Can we really gain access into the past? How do we really know what happens? There are loads of conspiracy theories out there. So, did people really land on the moon? Or was it just filmed in a TV studio somewhere in America? The death of Princess Diana, only just over 20 years ago. But could it have been faked? Did she really die in an accident? Can we really know anything about history? And if we can't, then there are quite massive implications. Let's think about the Holocaust, for example. These days, around Europe and the world, there are revisionist historians who deny that the Holocaust took place, or they deny the extent of it? Are we saying we can know nothing about it? Well, clearly, if you want to know about the Holocaust, you can go to eyewitnesses, photos, there's all kinds of evidence. You can actually interview guards and Jewish prisoners from the camps. There's video footage, lots of documentary evidence, official records, population statistics, and you can actually go and visit the place. I went to Auschwitz about 20 years ago, and it's quite a harrowing experience. It's been left there as testimony to what happened. So as we look at the Bible, we're going through a similar process. That means we can examine the evidence that we have, look at the very earliest manuscripts and compare them with sources outside the Bible. So here's the first question we're thinking: are the Bible manuscripts reliable? In other words, so you've got these uncovered books on your table. It's the Gospel of Mark. If you open it, how do you really know that these are Mark's words that he wrote down? So they've been translated into English from Greek, but how do I know they've not been changed through the centuries? So, for example, Chinese whispers. You know, someone says something, and then it gets changed a little bit, and then before long, you move far away from the original message. Well, there are two issues. How much manuscript evidence is there? And what are the ages of these texts? What is the gap between when it was written and our first manuscripts? Here are some famous works from the ancient world, which historians trust. So firstly, Homer's Iliad. If you look at that, the second one on the list gives his account of the Trojan War. Maybe you've seen one of the movies, you know, Brad Pitt, I remember him in Troy, I don't know how accurate that is. But if you want to read the original Iliad, it's the most well-attested document on our list. 643 copies, and the gap between when it was written and the first copy is 500 years. If you're looking for the complete version, then it's 1300 years later. If you look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, you've only got 10 copies, and the first one is 1,000 years after it was written. Let's flick up the next slide. Just have a look at the bottom. See how the New Testament compares with all of those ancient works. So the Greek manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament are over 5,000, by far and away the most of any ancient work. And this staggering wealth of evidence really helps scholars to get a very clear idea of what the original text actually said. If you look at the second criterion, the time lag between when it was written and the first copies, you'll see that it's much, much closer. Actually, our earliest fragment of the New Testament is from 125 AD, within 30 or 40 years of when it was written. And the entire New Testament, we have the earliest copy. You go to the British Library, we flick up the next slide. The Codex Sinaiticus, it's there in London, you can go in and see it. That was dates from around 325. That's just 250 years after these were written. So you can see, actually, by comparison, the gap is tiny compared to all of these other ancient documents. But you might be saying, well, you know, with all of these manuscripts, surely there are loads of contradictions between them. Maybe there are differences between all of these manuscripts. Maybe, how do we know which is the right one? Well, actually, there are some variations. In most cases, though, it's more to do with spelling and grammar. It doesn't actually affect the meaning. If we just flick up the next slide, this is what Craig Blomberg, a New Testament scholar, said. He said, overall, 97 to 99% of the New Testament can be reconstructed beyond any reasonable doubt. And no Christian doctrine is founded solely or even primarily on these disputed passages. So that means that actually we can get as close as possible to what these original texts actually said. We can be confident that when you open one of these books, what you're reading are the original words that actually the New Testament writers wrote down. Maybe that comes as a surprise to you, that actually there's such strong historical evidence for the New Testament. Well, you might say, well, that's fine, but it doesn't mean that the content is true. So maybe I know what Homer's Iliad says, but just because he wrote it, it doesn't mean that I believe all the mythology behind it. And we can ask exactly the same question with the Gospels in the New Testament. Can we trust that they are an accurate record of what actually happened? I think there are a number of related questions. Were the Gospel writers intending to write history, or were they just stories with a deeper meaning? Were they just invented by the disciples? Maybe it was just a big hoax that they wanted everyone to believe Jesus' teachings. Can we really trust what they wrote? Maybe they were biased. Maybe they had ulterior motives. And can we corroborate what they wrote with other accounts from non-Christian writers at the time? Maybe you're thinking, well, they contain lots of miracles. I mean, how can we believe that? Feeding 5,000 people and people rising from the dead. How can we actually take that as a historical account? Well, let's consider some of these issues. Firstly, are they written as historical accounts? If we just flick up the next slide. This is Luke at the beginning of his gospel. He's writing within 30 years of Jesus' life. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us from those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of this word, of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Can you see there, Luke acknowledges right from the very beginning there was an interest in Jesus' life. And in the Gospels we have 4 different accounts of Jesus' life. Actually, it's amazing that there are 4. That's a lot. I mean, if there had been 1 or 2, that would have told us something. But 4 different accounts from different angles which help us to build up an accurate picture of his life. And much better than having 1 account. He's speaking about how Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled, things which God had predicted came true in Jesus' life. And how did he go about writing it? Well, he speaks of carefully investigating everything from the beginning. And this wasn't just some airy-fairy guy. He was a doctor, someone who knew how to look for evidence and hard facts. And he describes the eyewitnesses who were around at the time, speaks of material coming from these eyewitnesses, people who had actually been there and heard Jesus speak themselves. Many of those who'd witnessed these things were still alive. So is he intending just to write stories or an accurate account? I think it's very clear what his intention is. He wants his reader, Theophilus, probably a Roman official, to be absolutely sure about what he's being taught about Jesus. Let's look at the next objection. Wasn't it all just invented by the disciples? Maybe as one big hoax. They got together and compared notes. Can we trust what they wrote, or are they maybe just biased? Well, I think there are a number of really strong answers to this challenge. Firstly, if they did make it up, why do the disciples sometimes portray themselves in a very bad light? So Peter, whose account we find in Mark's Gospel, he's behind that. It shows his denial of Jesus. All the Gospels show how slow the disciples were to actually believe who he was. It doesn't make them look good. As Oliver Cromwell instructed the artist who was painting his portrait, he instructed him to include the warts and all. And so we have these future leaders of the church, even denying Jesus at the critical hour. It would be so embarrassing if they just made it up. Actually, it shows what really happened. Secondly, why would these disciples be so willing to suffer for their faith in Jesus if they knew it was based on lies? So Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Paul was beheaded in Rome. Thomas was torn in two. Just about every apostle ended up dying a violent death, proclaiming their faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. If they'd invented it, then surely they wouldn't have been willing to suffer so much. Let's just look at the next quote. A guy called John Stott, he said, if anything is clear from the Gospels and Acts, it is that the apostles were sincere. They may have been deceived, if you like, but they were not deceivers. Hypocrites and martyrs are not made of the same stuff. Okay, so they were genuinely sincere, but were they biased? Were they biased? How can we trust what they say? Surely they had their own agenda, and as historians will say, there's no such person as someone who's completely unbiased and objective. all of us have our own understanding. Every person has their cultural backgrounds, their own subjective presuppositions. Well, if we think again about the Holocaust, when Jewish survivors arrived in America on the boats and they told of the atrocities of the Nazis in Europe, there were many who said, can we really trust what they're telling us? Surely they've got an ulterior motive. And yet they were telling the truth. And yes, it's true that these gospel writers, they're speaking about Jesus with a purpose. They want people to come to believe in him, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't trust them. If you get an innocent person, they've got an ulterior motive in saying what happened, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what they say is wrong. Well, can we measure up the gospel accounts with other writers, non-Christian writers of the time? Well, actually, there are quite a few writers who weren't Christians, who were actually anti-Christian, who wrote about Jesus. The first is Josephus. We just pick up the next slide. Yeah, it's the next one after that. Next one. Yeah, Josephus. You can go out and buy his book. So he was a Jewish scholar, born into a Jewish family in the 1st century, the time of Jesus. He was eventually captured by the Romans, and he wrote 2 great works describing extensively the history of the Jewish people and historical figures that we read about in the New Testament. So he described Herod and Pontius Pilate, the high priests. And let's just read the following quote from Josephus, where he describes Jesus' life. He said, and there arose about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed we should call him a man. For he was a doer of marvellous deeds, a teacher of men who received the truth with pleasure. He led away many Jews, and also many of the Greeks. This man was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross on his impeachment by the chief men among us, those who had loved him at the first did not cease. For he appeared to them on the 3rd day alive again, the divine prophets having spoken these, and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And even now the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not yet died out. The bits in italics, some people think maybe Christian scribes altered those. But the facts that Jesus lived and died under Roman rule are undeniable. He writes about Jesus, his deeds, his teaching, his death under Pontius Pilate. And even without the bits in italics, Josephus shows that Jesus certainly lived and did marvellous things and was condemned to die. Let's see one more. This is from a Roman historian, Tacitus. He wrote a history of Rome about 110 AD. He was a senator, a well-known orator, acknowledged as one of the great historians in history, and he writes about Emperor Nero and a fire that started in Rome in 64 AD. He said, therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for the moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a home. Can you see he's not very positive towards Christians? He calls this teaching a disease, a terrible disease. And we learn here about the terrible persecution that came on Christians, but also some facts about Christus, Christ, who'd faced the death penalty under Pontius Pilate. We know that Pontius Pilate ruled from 26 to 36 AD, so we can see here, even from these non-Christian accounts, the time where Jesus lived and died. He describes Jesus as Christus, which means the Messiah. And we don't know a lot of other things from his account, but clearly Jesus was a historical person who lived and died, as the Gospels said. Let's look at our next question. What about the miracles? How do we explain them? I think in general we need to acknowledge the skepticism towards the supernatural that exists in our times. And if we're going to reject miracles, are we saying that they're a logical impossibility? Have we completely closed our minds to the possibility of miracles? If scientific knowledge is based on experimentation and observation, do we ourselves have the complete knowledge to rule out the possibility of miraculous. And the Christian contention is that in Jesus, God has stepped into this world. If that's the case, wouldn't we expect there to be some things out of the ordinary? Wouldn't we expect there to be some things which shows that he's more than just a man, that he would display his power in some remarkable ways? It's exactly what we would expect. And when we read the gospel accounts, we find that the people who witness Jesus' miracles are very down-to-earth people, people like fishermen, people who are not taken in by tricks. And we see the reaction of people as they witness Jesus' miracles. It has the ring of truth. They're frightened, surprised, shocked, amazed. It's acknowledged that these things are unusual. And the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection of Jesus, is hard to explain in other terms than a God-ordained miracle. So countless witnesses saw him die. The Romans were expert executioners. They would have been sure to confirm that he was dead. His body was placed in a tomb with a huge stone rolled over the entrance, and yet 3 days that tomb was empty. The disciples who'd fled in fear as cowards, it's so unlikely that they would have overpowered a cohort of Roman soldiers and then stolen the body of Jesus. And these were the same people who ended up dying martyrs' deaths, proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. And there was a massive change that happened in them from being afraid of their lives. Suddenly, just weeks later, they were standing before crowds proclaiming their faith in Jesus. So there's lots of strong evidence, historical evidence for the resurrection if you look into it. So is the Bible reliable? Is the Bible really reliable? I would say yes. God's given us these 4 gospel accounts, and we can read them and discover about Jesus. But just as we finish, what is the story of the Bible? What's it about? Just very briefly, what's the message of the Bible? Yes, maybe we can trust it, but what's it actually saying? As I mentioned, if you open up the Bible, you'll see it's actually a library of books, 66 books, written by 40 authors from all different walks of life. Some written by kings, by fishermen, by tax collectors, by doctors, by tent makers. It was written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Written in 3 languages, in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And yet, through all of that diversity, all of these different authors, there's an amazing coherence and unity. It all fits together and makes sense. If you read it, there's one consistent, unified message running right the way through, from beginning to end. Just think for a moment of your favourite movie or novel. Just think what that is. And if you think any movie or novel will have a plot, a problem that needs to be solved. So a romance movie, a relationship problem. Will the guy get the girl or not? You have, movies like Taken, thriller movies. Is the guy going to achieve his goal? Let's just flick up the next slide. I love Lord of the Rings, those movies. And I guess we know what the plot line is there. So you've got Frodo. He's got this ring that's corrupting everyone. Will he be able to get it to Mount Doom to destroy it? If you've not seen the movies, I won't tell you what happens. And there are a lot of other interesting subplots along the way. Well, similarly, the Bible has one main plot line. In the beginning, God creates everything. We're not here just by accident. And he creates us as people to live in relationship with him, to take care of this beautiful world he's created. But right at the beginning, in the 3rd chapter of the Bible, we see that humankind turns away from God. We choose to go our own way and turn our backs on God. And this is what the Bible calls the fall. It calls it sin. And the results are absolutely devastating. We see people's relationship is broken with God. They're banished from his presence. And all kinds of terrible things come in. Shame, broken relationships with each other. Very soon we see violence and murder and pride and a broken world. And we're cut off from the God who made us. And the big question that the whole of the rest of the Bible is answering, more than 1,000 chapters, is how can we be brought back to God? is there a way back to this God who made us? In the Old Testament, we see how God announces his plan to rescue the world. He calls one man, Abraham, gives some amazing promises to him to make him into a great nation. And he says that through one of his descendants, all peoples on earth will be blessed. And through the story of Israel, we see God promising this Saviour figure called the Messiah. And there are many things revealed about his life and what he'll do. And the whole Bible is focused on this person who comes, and it's all pointing to Jesus. As we get to the New Testament, Jesus comes and we see his remarkable life, a perfect life, the most loving man who ever lived, complete compassion and kindness for those who are rejected by society. And he does amazing things. As God on earth, he shows incredible authority. He can calm a storm, he can raise the dead, he can open the eyes of blind people. He even claims the authority to forgive sins. And at the very heart of Jesus' mission is him coming to die on a Roman cross, to take on himself all the punishment for our sin, the ways in which we've rejected God and gone our own way. And so the Bible points to Jesus as the very center of history. But Jesus didn't stay dead. 3 days later, he rose back to life to overcome death. And the Bible shows that these events are right at the heart of God's plan. The rest of the New Testament describes how this message is spreading to people from all nations. There is also an end to the Bible. It's an end which hasn't yet happened. The Bible has a beginning, it also has an end. It says that at some point in history, Jesus will return. And there'll be a day called the Judgment Day when one day each of us individually will stand before God to give an account of our life. Well, I just want to finish by saying that being a Christian is not just about knowing intellectual facts. It's actually about coming back to God through Jesus and enjoying a personal relationship with him. And I just encourage you to check it out for yourselves. 20 years ago, the movie Titanic came out. And I remember having an hour-long conversation with a friend about the film. I'd just seen it. And he hated it. And after an hour of debating with him, myself and a few other friends, I realised that my friend Sam hadn't actually seen the movie. He knew all about it from what he'd read in magazines and newspapers and on TV. He'd never actually seen the movie. And I think his arguments just fell flat. He didn't have any credibility. And so I would say to you, have you read the Bible? No matter what you think of it, I'd encourage you to pick it up and check it out for yourself, to read it and see if these things really do measure up. The best thing is to read one of these uncover accounts. It's focused on Jesus. That's the very heart of what the Bible message is all about. Well, thanks for being so patient and listening, and I think we'll have some questions in a few minutes.
We've had a couple of questions texted in, so we're just going to have the time of seeing what Charlie's got to say. So the first question, if Jesus died on a specific day, why does Easter move every year? And why is Christmas Day on the 25th of December if he actually wasn't born on that day? Does the Bible tell you the exact day he was born and died? And does the Bible contain any actual facts?
Okay. Good question. Yeah. You may realise that someone who worked out the dates got it all wrong. That when Jesus had to have been born by 4 BC, because that was when Herod the Great died. So the guy who worked out the year Jesus died clearly got it wrong. Christmas isn't when Jesus was born. That's pretty clear. It's likely he would have been born around September. There are some historical details which link with John the Baptist's birth, which you can work it out when the priests were in the temple, that Jesus must have been born around September, which makes sense because no shepherd in Israel would be out with their sheep at night in the middle of December because it's freezing cold. So that date came about. It was when the Roman Empire was Christianized, and they took a pagan festival and changed it to be a Christian one. But I don't think anyone was seeing that as the real date when Jesus was born. In terms of when Jesus died, we know exactly when it was. It wasn't anything to do with the Christian calendar of Easter, but the Jewish festival of Passover. That's when he died, in the year 30 AD. So that's a different calendar, so we can be very specific about when that happened. So I would say, yeah, the Bible does have a lot of historical evidence within it. If you study it and search for it, there's a lot that you can find out. That was the first question. Great.
Can you tell us more about the prophecies that came true in the life of Jesus? Couldn't these details have been made up by the writers?
Very good question. Paul Daniels, the magician, once said Jesus was just a very clever magician. He could do tricks. And someone said to Paul Daniels, well, let's crucify you and see if you come back from the dead 3 days later. There are many things in Jesus' life which fulfilled Scripture, which he could not manufacture himself, which the Gospel writers couldn't change. So if you go to Israel, you will find the Dead Sea Scrolls. They go back to before the time of Jesus. There are fragments from all different books of the Old Testament and a complete scroll of the prophet Isaiah. I've been to Jerusalem and seen it myself, and I've read the bits which describes Jesus' death from Isaiah 53, written before Jesus lived. And it describes the death of God's servant in this way. Surely he took up our pain, bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we are healed. It says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. So it describes how Jesus died being pierced in Roman crucifixion. It also describes the reactions of people thinking that he's been punished by God. And Jesus' own reaction of not opening his mouth, not resisting arrest. It goes on to speak about him being assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. So Jesus was crucified between two criminals, two murderers, and he was buried in a rich man's grave. So all the gospel writers affirm that. And at the end of this passage, it says, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. It describes him coming back to life. A friend of mine in Israel once read this chapter to Jewish friends of his and said, what have I read to you just now? And they said, well, you've read from the New Testament about Jesus. And he uncovered the title and said, actually, no. This is from one of your scriptures written 700 BC, describing the Messiah. There are numerous other prophecies that were fulfilled in Jesus' life, where he would be born in Bethlehem. So you will not get a Jewish Messiah being born in Bethlehem today. And about where he would live, what he would do, the kinds of things that would happen in his life. And there are many prophecies also about Jesus' return, which haven't yet taken place. So many, some would say something like 200 that have already been fulfilled in Jesus' life, and others yet to happen.